All right, we're on. Go ahead, Jameen.
All right. Thank you, Henry, for juggling 1 million screens. I am Jameen Brooks-Kiefer. I'm the Data Services Librarian at the University of Kansas, and I got suckered, maybe is the right word, into moderating this morning panel on research data management. So we are all learning from each other. This is, I think what Henry says is this is a learning experience doomed to failure. So we'll take everything positive as a triumph. So this morning we have a panel on what is research data management and ways that various librarians, crap.
What happened?
Did I freeze?
No, your
video.
Oh, on my screen it looked like I froze. Sorry. So we have our panel is on research data management, both in local contexts, sort of around the country, from various people who are practicing as librarians and research data managers, and then a little bit in a slightly broader context that you may find resonates for you with the stuff that you've been working on over the course of this week. So I want to take a moment to have all of the panelists introduce themselves, and since everyone but Jen is remote, I'm going to be calling on everybody. And Jen, since you're in person, will you please go first?
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Jen Zhao. I'm at the Smithsonian Institution, and what I do is I help researchers around the world manage trail cam data for animal monitoring studies using a software called eMammal.
Thank you. Vas, can you please go next?
Yes, hi, good morning everyone. My name is Vas Vasiliadis from the University of Chicago. I work on a project called Globus here at the university that is a research data management software that we provide to the community.
Thank you. Megan, please.
Hi, my name is Megan O'Donnell. I'm the Data Services Librarian at Iowa State University.
Thank you, Megan. Pete?
I'm Pete Schlax. I'm the Science and Data Librarian at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. And I provide, I'm basically a resource for the faculty and students in terms of research data management and research data management plans.
Thank you, Pete. And Mara?
My name is Mara Sedlins, and I'm the Data Management Specialist at Colorado State University Libraries. And I offer workshops and consultations on best practices in research data management. I help connect researchers to the resources that they need. And I also do data curation for submissions to our institutional repository.
Thank you, Mara. And as I said, my name is Jameen Brooks-Kiefer. My title is Data Services Librarian. I'm at the University of Kansas, and I do things very similar to many of the things that our panelists have already mentioned, workshops, consultations, all in that space of data management when researchers are in the middle of their projects. So at this point, we're going to go into round one of our panel discussion, and this is a discussion for the panelists. Each panelist has about 3 minutes to describe 1 or 2 services or programs that they facilitate or assist with in the area of research data management. And I started with Jen before. I'm going to flip it and start with Mara. Are you ready? Okay, thanks, Mara. Go ahead.
Great. So I've only been at Colorado State for just less than a year now, but the person who was in my position before me started a wonderful workshop series called Data and Donuts that's been very successful. I think whenever food is involved, that's a good thing. So I've continued that series, and that's included topics like how to write a data management plan, how to keep your data tidy if you're using Excel, using tools like OpenRefine to clean data, and then how to go about preparing your data for archiving and choose a repository for your data. There's also a series called Coding and Cookies that's focused on introductory material for learning R. And with that, I've actually partnered with the statistics department on campus I do have some familiarity with R, but we have statistics grad students come in and lead those workshops because that's something that they work with every single day. And so they can answer kind of the more complex questions that might come up. So that's also been a very successful workshop series. I think there's a lot of interest in learning R among graduate students. So we plan to continue both of those workshop series next year. Something else that I've been involved in is a series of interviews with researcher groups on campus about their use of cyber infrastructure and their cyber infrastructure needs. And I actually stepped in to help with this because our cyber infrastructure facilitator left, and we just recently rehired for that position. But it's also been a great opportunity to learn kind of where researchers' pain points are and to get a sense of their current data management practices and ways that we might better help them in the future. Was that about 3 minutes? Or how am I doing on time?
No, you're fine. I'm sorry. My Zoom was frozen. I couldn't unmute myself.
Oh, okay.
You've got about a minute left if you want to, if there's something else you want to talk about, or you can be done.
Sure. I mean, another really fun part of my job is I moderate all of the data deposits that come into our institutional repository. So as part of my job, I help researchers figure out the best home for their data once their project is done. And oftentimes that is the institutional repository, although it isn't always. We encourage people to deposit data in disciplinary repositories where it's appropriate. But it's really fun for me to see the variety of different data sets coming in and help make sure that they're properly documented so that somebody else who's looking at this data would understand what's going on.
All right, thank you. That sounds fascinating. You get to do cyber infrastructure and curation. That's awesome. Let me clear up my timer because yes, I do have a timer. Oh, stop it. I'll just start a new one. Let's see, Vas, how about you go next?
Sure, thanks. So yeah, as I mentioned, I work on the Globus project. So Globus is software as a service for research data management. It's an effort that we've started, well, it actually goes back the better part of 20 years now, but for the last about 9 years, we've been operating the software as a service on behalf of the community, and it's used by a few hundred campuses in the US as well as people abroad, many of the national labs, supercomputing facilities, and a number of federal agencies as well. Essentially, at its core, it's a service for moving data around, fast and securely. It's also used extensively for sharing data with collaborators at other institutions without requiring that the data are moved to some specific place or having folks jump through a whole bunch of administrative hoops to get access to data. We added capabilities to the service to allow folks to work with protected data. So in many sort of clinical settings and things like that, where there's personal health information and so on, that's now something that's also supported. And we also have the ability to build these capabilities into other data portals, science gateways, and sort of existing research data management workflows. So we have a number of instruments, for instance, that use our service to pull data off of the cryo-EM or light sheet microscope or advanced light source or what have you, and put it somewhere where people can compute in it. There are also capabilities for describing, sort of adding metadata to describe the data sets that people are generating, to generate persistent identifiers like DOIs and ARCs and so on, and then make those available through a search engine that we also have. So we have a number of different services that people can sort of compose, if you will, and build their own data portals or data management solutions, as well as sort of a turnkey web app that allows you to do simple transfer and sharing. And so we work with essentially all the disciplines. We started out with a focus in high energy physics and astrophysics and all of that, and the folks at sort of the traditional big data realms. As everybody's aware, that sort of now spans every discipline. So we work across the board with many diverse set of projects.
Thank you. 15 seconds left, so very precise. Let's see. Jen, how about you?
Okay. So my main job is working on the email software, which is a desktop application that feeds a cloud tool. And then after that's all done, so the desktop app, people identify animals in the camera trap data. So trail cams have sequence of photos where there's deer walking through the camera. So every single time a volunteer or an intern has to go through and says, that's a deer, etc. And then it all goes up to a cloud app where then experts review that. So we have scientists, we have better interns look at that data again and say, yes, that's a deer. No, that's not a squirrel, that's a fox. Hopefully they're better than that. And then when that all is done, it goes into a Smithsonian repository, which we handle, and then it's all managed by a website. And I make sure none of that breaks. And as you know, a lot of these things break a lot. So what this program is really good for is for distributed systems. So like citizen scientists, or when you have classrooms of students all uploading data, this makes sure that all that metadata is consistent. And currently we have users from 25 countries, over 1,000 users, and one me, so that's really fun. And at the institutional level, I'm also helping with an effort to do a data palooza, where we're trying to bring researchers across all 19 museums and 7 research institutes at the Smithsonian to understand how they go through the data lifecycle, where we can find overlaps between researchers. And because the Smithsonian is so decentralized, everyone kind of does their own thing, but we're trying to like see if we can pull people together with that. How am I doing on time, Jimmy?
You've got a minute left.
Okay, well, for eMammal, we're trying to do a nationwide study called Snapshot USA. So what that is that we've already done a statewide study in North Carolina. In every single county, they had citizen scientists put out cameras and bring data together about the state of North Carolina. And now we're trying to replicate that on a state level. So if you think you have ecologists in your area that know like camera trapping and would be interested, especially researchers at like professors at universities that want to do it in this like cover it in a class, that would be great. Let me know. Cool.
All right, thank you, Jen. I'm making a note of that because I know we have people doing camera traps at our biological field station, so they might be interested. Let's see, Megan, please.
Okay, I'm going to try holding the mic. Is this better?
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Okay. So I'm the data services librarian at Iowa State, and that encompasses a lot of things because right now we're a group of 1 doing data services at the library. So I have been organizing and doing basic workshops on best practices, which sometimes are very simple things like how to organize and name files, the basics of setting up a spreadsheet, to how to write a data management plan and meet federal funding requirements, because there is a lot of jargon in those requirements that people are not trained to interpret. And honestly, I am not sure if the people who wrote them knew what all those terms meant or how they should be interpreted at the time, so we're still learning. More recently, we just opened a data repository here at Iowa State, so I'm also starting to do curation where people are sharing out their data. It's really fun, but it's also been very complicated because we get data in various states of readiness. We also will not share or publish data if it's not labeled, explained, or organized, and trying to tell researchers that has been an interesting experience. Someone said, this is what it is, take it or leave it. And I was like, well, we're leaving it in this case because I don't know what it is. It's literally just numbers in a text file. So it's also, I'm calling it kind of intervention curation, where we get the data, we take a look at it, and then we see what some really easy fixes can be, and then we move up from there depending on how devoted the researcher is, willing to learn and willing to work with the data. And sometimes, and we compromise too, because we also have specialty file types. We learned we just can't transform into something more preservable, usually coming out of our physics and material science labs. So, is that it about time?
You've got almost a minute left.
Okay, so I'll just say, something we're working on is trying to develop some best practices for data preservation for the repository. Right now, that's a very difficult thing to do because it varies a lot. So mostly it's just basic things like if you're sharing out data, don't do it in an Excel file, turn it into a CSV file or a TSV file, plain text is better, things like that. But these are all things they're not taught usually as they go through school. So it's fun though.
Thank you, Megan. Pete.
We're probably the smallest group in the bunch here, so I probably do a little of everything that people have talked about. So I certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about cyber infrastructure, and because we're an undergraduate institution and we've got a lot of turnover in the student researchers, trying to figure out ways that we can encapsulate different aspects of the data lifecycle in terms of tools or resources that can be easily understood for people that are maybe only going to have to work with them for 6 months or a year is really important. And I think it also helps the faculty really sort of grab onto it when they realize they need something at a specific point in the life cycle they may not have thought about. One of the ways that I can help faculty is I work with the grants department and I get to see every grant that goes through, and if anything needs a research data management plan, even if it's not required, I get to consult with the faculty and really think about what's appropriate, what kind of resources that we already have, and maybe what we might need to build out so that we're not committing to something that we really don't know about or will be a surprise somewhere down the road, like petabytes of data come in from a project, and now we've signed off that we're going to keep it somewhere. So those kinds of things are really where I focused, because there wasn't really a lot of that when I started. So things like collaborative file shares and easy ways to access those and get student permissions, different kinds of permissions within those file shares, removing those permissions when the students move on. We also have an institutional repository, and I built out a place for people to put their data there. We're much smaller than all of you, and fortunately, since I built it out with the first test case, which I think went really well and has been downloaded thousands of times, which is great and rewarding, most of the faculty research scholarship gets to go to other repositories, which everyone here is going to tell you is what you want. You want it to be with data that's very similar to that kind of data, so it's discoverable, and the metadata schemas have already been worked out and all those great things. So those kinds of things. So really, I would say that my role here is to liaise with faculty and students to get them to those resources, and also to give instruction and best practices, and then to have a way for them to work with their data at every stage of the data lifecycle and understanding why that's important.
Thank you, Pete. So I think you may be starting to get the idea that there's a lot of stuff going on with a lot of different people, and people do things differently. In terms of what I do at KU, like Megan, I'm a group of one. I do have some help from colleagues I have co-opted into learning to do some stuff. But primarily, my focus is on either group workshops or individual consultations on research data management basics. And those are things like how to name files, how to choose your storage options, what are your storage options on this campus, how to do backups and how to keep your backups current. And those sound like, as Megan said, those sound like very sort of low-level things, but they're really critical when you get into like 3 to 5 years into a project, or when you start applying computation to a project. Those choices that you made make a big difference down the road. In terms of leading people into computation, I'm also a certified carpentry instructor, and so we've been offering about 2 software carpentry workshops a year. We're gearing up to be able to offer more. And if you're not familiar with carpentry, carpentry offers teaching and foundational computing skills, and it's not intended to make researchers into programmers, but it is intended to introduce people and give them a foothold so that they can keep learning on their own. And then in the 2 seconds I have left, one of the things I've been playing with this year is messing around with reproducing computing environments so that we could potentially store the results of experiments or websites that are about to be taken down in our institutional repository in a compressed format. And those experiments are kind of as I have time, but that's pretty fun. So at this point, we are at the first round of Q&A, and we have about 15 minutes to hear from you, hear from the attendees, both in person and in TV land, as Henry says. And I want to open the floor first to see if anybody has things they want to talk about more. If you don't want to talk, we have some questions to sort of nudge you into talking. And I'm going to watch the participant list on Zoom for anybody who raises their hand. If my Zoom responds.
Jimmy,
as well.
bring the people here in.
Absolutely, please. If Jen, if you could watch in the room, because I can't see the room itself.
Okay, we've got a question
We have
here.
a chat question too.
Okay.
Okay, my Zoom is being really slow, so Jen, if you could referee that first question from the room, and then I'll see if I can get things moving here.
Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about data management plans, but I haven't heard a lot about methods for those things. I want to ask about DMP tool and anybody else that uses it.
Okay. Basically, what are tools for DMPs, data management plans, and what was the other part?
DMP tool from the California Library.
DMP tool from the California libraries.
I can answer that unless another panelist wants to.
Go for it.
So DMP tool is a nice tool that helps you kind of break down the requirements of different agencies while writing a data management plan. If your institution is also a supporter, the admin can add customized areas that match certain themes that will be accessible to the researcher as they write their data management plan. That can be really useful for providing access to campus services and encouraging them to integrate those into your data management plan. However, you won't know how they're being integrated. And this kind of came up in the chat when someone said they were jealous of Pete, who can actually see DMPs. I like DMP tool, but it's not everything. So it kind of assumes a certain level of literacy already with the topic, in my opinion, but it is a very useful tool.
I guess I would also like to add that we consider data management the DMP tool, and I think it's gone through a couple of rounds, so it's probably in like version 2 now. And one of the things that I think faculty members who haven't done a lot of data management planning or written a plan before really like is the ability to see other people's data management plans. And we already basically share those out in-house with a shared Google folder so that faculty members that are interested in letting other people see their plans, they can see it. And one of the things about the data management plan that basically turned us away from it was that we had already built in-house a lot of the kind of open worksheet sort of parts of the data management plan that were already there. We built out something like that based on the requirements for the NSF data management plan. And really, it's just kind of an open worksheet. There are some fields that you get prompted for, but we had already been prompting for those. And I think one of the things that our tool in-house did that I think we didn't really need to reproduce there was just the ability to sort of connect the needs with kind of named resources that we already had. So as Jameen was saying that, you know, like what places do you need to store your data? We already have them and we've kind of named them. And so with the tools that we've used, it's easier to connect people to the need and the solution to the need, you know, in a Bates way, using kind of a Bates tool, because the data management plan is sort of an open workbook. And so if you've got something like that already, it might not help you that much.
I've used the data management plan tool as a teaching tool, where I've gone in and I've done guest lectures on data management, and the instructors actually had students do an assignment ahead of time where they go to the DMP tool and walk through the steps of writing each section of a data management plan, and then we use that as a discussion tool during the lecture.
Any other comments on the data management plan tool, the DMP tool? Okay, so we have a question from Anita, and it's in the chat. And before we move on, I should add that I'm not able to scroll to see all of the participants to see if you poked the raise hand button. So if you do have a question and you're on Zoom, just go ahead and type it into the chat, and hopefully that will keep us moving forward. So Anita's question is, can each of the panelists comment on your storage for different phases of your data? This is a really good question. Everybody else has been talking. I'll take a turn, and then we'll just pass it around. So when I talk to researchers here at KU, we don't have a terribly sophisticated set of storage services offered by the university. We have some research storage that, you know, some of it's free. If you need a lot, it's paid. Comes as a mapped network drive. We have OneDrive, which is available for everyone and is, they say, appropriate for some forms of research data. But we don't have anything other than the institutional repository for that kind of long-term, once the project is over, kind of archival. I mean, I hesitate to use the word archival as a librarian, kind of long-term dark storage. We don't really have anything like that. But when I do talk to researchers, I do talk about those phases of the project. Like, let's talk about what you need as in the active phase, what you need as you're winding down, and then what you need moving forward so that you can find it later on. Does somebody else want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I can make some comments on what we've seen, because we worked with, as I said, you know, many institutions on this topic specifically of, you know, getting their storage enabled so that people can easily get to their data and move their data around and so on. And I'd say I'd echo some of the earlier remarks you just made, Jameen, which is that most people don't really have sort of a plan or a structured sort of tiered storage system as some of the, you know, the industry folks have, where, you know, data sort of moves progressively, well, up or down depending on how you think sort of the data temperature scale, right? The less frequently used and the more sort of archival like it is, right? Most to tape or what have you. But most schools have a sort of a dumping ground, is what I affectionately call it, where, you know, all data ends up, in some cases that's Google Drive, and in some cases it's OneDrive. Box is there. A lot of schools have sort of institutional licenses for Box, and that's sufficient, I think, for sort of smaller data sets. The challenge is when we get to some of the, and I was mentioning instruments earlier, you know, some of these instruments are generating terabytes of data a day, and in some cases, you know, the researchers need to store even the raw data beyond just the final sort of products that they generate through their research. So people are turning to cloud solutions and sort of hybrid things where some things are kept sort of online on campus, on sort of hot storage, and then other things are moved out to things like Glacier and other cloud storage systems. But we've seen very little, and there's only with a few exceptions that come to mind, where people have really sat down and said they're going to plan out the tiered storage architecture. That tends to be very much the exception.
Thank you, Vas. And that, I'm glad you mentioned that, like the sort of mix of relying on institutional services and consumer grade services. Basically, I really try to steer people toward institutional services, not only because that has, and I don't know, maybe a veil of security, and it may only be a veil, but a veil of security. But also, if the institution isn't able to meet people's storage needs, the institution needs to hear about that. So that's a tension that I work with a lot. Other panelists want to pick up the storage question?
Yeah, so at my institution, I'm still relatively new, so I still feel as though I'm getting a sense of what all of the options are. It's fairly distributed. We do have a paid storage option that's offered centrally, but that's negotiated at the college level, not the researcher level. Something that I would really like to be able to offer to researchers on my campus is an online resource really summarizing what the different storage options are. And really a great example of that I've seen is there is a data storage finder interactive website at Cornell. I can put the link in the chat. So this is, I think, a really good model for keeping all of that information in one place and making it really easy, depending on what type of data you have, what stage of the research you're at, what is the appropriate storage. So this is a problem that I'm still working on.
Mara, can you hear us?
I wouldn't mind hopping in just for a second. I would just echo that I think for most of the places that I know that are about our size, actually, so we have about 2,000 students and about 200 faculty, so that shows you kind of where we are, and I think most of you are much larger than that. So we don't really have tiered storage, and our storage isn't paid. It's actually paid for through the college, and to this point, we've been able to manage all the storage needs, even as they're growing, for all the faculty that come in. And as faculty come in with significantly greater storage needs, it sort of gets worked out through their startup package that maybe they're going to have something added to what we have centrally. But the problem I think that that we need to be aware of here at Bates is just at some point faculty want to share those data out with colleagues at other institutions, and that's becoming a bigger and bigger thing with newer faculty. And the security issue that that Jameen was talking about is really a big deal. So I think, well, why can't we just let people have access to the storage that we have here? And our security people say that's never going to happen. And so then we need to push the data off to some third party, like Box or something like that, and you just don't have the same level of access, and then you have to start paying for it in a different way. And you can't sort of have the granular control that we have at this level for letting students have access and not have access and things like that. So again, just sort of understanding the life cycle and getting the users to understand that at some point in that life cycle, it may change from what they're used to dealing with. That's really important to get across early on, because if they say, well, Box isn't going to work for us, we need to know that. That's been kind of a pinch point here.
And then for us, for the local stuff, for eMammal, we have the working data is on the local computer. The desktop app is only on your computer. Only you see the data before you go through and tag all the animals and tag it with the correct metadata. And then when it's to be reviewed, that data is in the cloud, because we don't want that data in our on-prem storage without a second pair of eyes on that. And our on-prem solution is something that the Smithsonian created with the hope that other people would join it, but it's really clunky. It's really hard to get in. Like we're still like my system is still mostly the only system that uses it. So the Smithsonian as a whole is looking for some sort of like homegrown solution that's like a dumping ground, but it's also searchable, because we need somewhere where researchers can store, unstructured data, like a lot of the data that, the raw data, but then the data that they're working on. So it's sort of like working data, and then the finalized data. We're also bringing on Figshare, so that we're hoping that'll help us with the published data and sharing that. Figshare is basically a cloud-based tool for publishing data.
Thanks, everybody. There's a rippling conversation going on in the chat about tape, which I think we're probably just going to leave in the chat for the moment, and we can come back to it. There was a point, and of course now my Zoom is not allowing me to scroll, but there was a point about any solution that allows people to move files from one storage system to another, maybe not accepting the same file naming style or having other issues. So that is a good point when we're talking about moving things around depending on the stage of the project. So we're going to move on at this point. If you have other questions and I'm not seeing them, feel free to shout at somebody else. We're going to have another question round at the end of the next panelist round. For panelist round 2, we've been talking about kind of the local context of research data management, and so this is a space for just broader topics, and these are all each determined by the panelists, so nobody got assigned a topic. And since Megan may have to depart her meeting room, she might get evicted at 10 o'clock, I'm going to let Megan go first. So Megan, take it away, about 3 minutes.
All right. So one of the things I want to touch on is that data is kind of slowly being recognized as maybe as important as research papers, or more important by the community. And depending on the research community, this may be a very easy sell, or it may still be a very new sell for the community and they're not on board with it. So one of the things I'm really trying to do at Iowa State is to facilitate data as what I call a first-class research object, which means we treat it in many ways the same way as a research publication. We want it to be accessible for the long term. We want it to be findable. We want people to be able to use it. This is, like I said, for some groups, very easy because they've been kind of doing this for a while. And in other disciplines, it's not something they're used to. And this also ties into what I call the academic credit system, which has to do with P&T, which is a lot of times based on your research outputs. So that means looking at citation metrics, how many times your work has been cited, where you're publishing, which journals it's in, and all of that. And if we start treating data like a publication, we can also start capturing metrics on it, which means that can be included in your P&T process for going out for promotion and tenure. A lot of schools do not have protocols or advice on how to include data in promotion and tenure. I think Iowa State is probably high up on that list. We're starting to. Some colleges have instructions and some don't. But every time I talk to a researcher, I'm like, make sure now that you share data with us, make sure you include this on your resume. And you might want to mark the publications that you've also shared data with, because sometimes they're also sharing data through publishers and not just through a separate repository or as a separate object. So this is a very evolving area because there are some best practices coming out on data citation. I've seen 2 or 3 recent publications on this, some of it, but it's been going on for a few years. Luckily, we also use Figshare. Jen mentioned that. It has a data citation tool, which is great because you can choose the type of citation you want to generate and it generates it. And so normalizing things like that makes it much easier for, I think, researchers to pick up on that this is an important thing. They need to spend time on it. They need to make it actually reusable and accessible, and that we can help them with that process. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with the P&T process, especially for tenured faculty, but those metrics for citations are really important. And I'm hoping someday software and data will be able to be included in those evaluations.
Thank you, Megan. Pete.
I wanted to talk a little bit about just sort of branding, thinking about the life cycle of the data for researchers, and sort of branding the different tools that you would use for different parts of it. I think that at least my experience with faculty dealing with the data management plan and just thinking about the life cycle of the data is that they often come to the project thinking about that at the very end of the grant. So they've done a lot of very hard thinking about the science that they're going to do or the questions that they're going to ask, and that's really the grant for them. And then the rest is sort of boilerplate. And the data management plan, which is really about 2 pages, is part of that boilerplate. And they want to just sort of do it in the last sort of, hour before they turn the thing in. And so what I really try to do here, and what I think is important just in terms of getting across the importance of managing the data throughout the data lifecycle, is to try to break it up into parts and to really be able to sort of brand and talk about each tool and how it can help. So one example is, and it basically goes to this idea of thinking about data as an object. One part especially at an undergraduate institution, of the life cycle is just sort of skimming the cream from a notebook, because students are only there for 6 months or 12 months, and that work might go into a paper, that's the goal, but it may be 2 years away. And so being able to sort of curate that at that sort of intermediate stage is really important. And this idea of a data paper was really attractive to me. And so one of the things that I and another person did here was sort of build out a Drupal tool that would allow faculty to sort of have their own little space in this tool with the students that they work with and other researchers, and build out a data paper for finished data and be able to provide the narrative for those data without discussion and without introduction. So it's basically a finished chunk of information. And just having tools like that and sort of providing some of the clues for the kinds of metadata that you would need, I think really helps break up the process. And then when they get to that point of being able to think about the life cycle of their data, we have tools that we can point to that have very specific needs and value, hopefully for them. So I think that that's something that's sort of generally applicable when thinking about data management.
Thank you, Pete. Who's next? Vas, please.
So the area that we're starting to focus on is sort of generally speaking automation, and really this is a reflection of the growing velocity of data as well as the scale of the data. And so, as I said earlier, what we have in place today is mechanisms for moving data, sharing data, all nice and secure. But we have some simple tools that you can use to sort of automate, recurring transfers and things like that. But what we're seeing is a need for making that much more robust and much more sort of configurable and able for make it available to researchers to essentially build their own data workflows, for lack of a better term. So if you think of our canonical example is, data coming off of an instrument again, these are shared expensive resources, so you need some way to get that data off there reliably. In some cases, these experiments cannot be repeated literally, so it's a one-shot deal, and you want to move it off there and perhaps do some pre-processing on it before you take it somewhere for further analysis and so on. So there's all these steps in the data workflow that really need to be automated, because obviously trying to do it manually at scale it's just not feasible, and it's very error prone. So that's an area we're spending a lot of time on, is to build these. If you sort of the analogy we use is, if anybody's heard of if this then that, it's a service for home automation and other things. So when I drive up the driveway and the sensor picks up my car, turn on the heat or whatever, that kind of thing, right? It's the same idea, to sort of make it very, very simple for folks to sort of drag and drop pieces and say, okay, when this happens here, put my data here, share it with my collaborators here, and so on, and just make it all seamless. So that's a big focus for us. The other area that we spent a lot of time on the last probably 18 months and continue to focus on is integrating the research data management capabilities into interactive environments like Jupyter Lab, because we're seeing that being used increasingly everywhere for sort of more interactive analyses and sort of interactive data science, if you will, and having the ability to access very diverse data sources, storage systems, and bring those into an interactive environment is very important. And also to do that securely is kind of critical. So we've spent a lot of time on the security aspects of that. I don't know how much time. Yeah.
You have 17 seconds. So.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Mara, please.
Hopefully my internet connection will hold out. If I start breaking up again, just let me know and I can switch to a different room. So what I wanted to talk about is actually overlapping quite a bit with what the other panelists have covered. But generally speaking, I'm interested in ways to encourage open science, data sharing where possible, and reproducible research. And I think of this partly as just a shift in mindset among researchers. I know that when I was a graduate student doing my own research, it felt pretty isolating, and there was this pressure to produce results and to get things written up. And so data management and keeping things documented well was definitely not a priority. But I think that this is becoming increasingly important. And so if there are ways to encourage kind of more of a collaborative mindset, I think that when researchers are forced to collaborate with others, or hopefully not forced to, but when they collaborate with others, it forces them to think about data management in a different way. And I think that even if researchers are working on their own, it could be a helpful exercise to think of their research as being collaborative, either with their future self or with potential reusers of their data. And so I think training researchers to think in this way from the beginning could be an important way to, an interesting way to think about this. Again, valuing not only the articles that you produce, but having high quality data that's well organized and well documented. I would love to see that valued as much as your publication list. In terms of changing the reward structure, in Colorado, we recently had a panel about this very topic of valuing sharing open access research products in the tenure and promotion process. And we had a great set of discussions, but most of the attendees at the event were librarians. And so this is something that I don't see as much interest coming from faculty. So I'd love to see that change in the future, but again, it's hard to make that change from within the library. Let's see, what else? I really liked Pete's idea of training student researchers to create kind of self-explanatory, self-contained research projects. This kind of reminds me of a project called the TIER protocol, which is also a training approach where, and I think it's often used in introductory research methods classes. So it's Teaching Integrity in Empirical Research. And it's a framework for keeping your research materials organized in a particular way. So you have a separate folder for your raw data, for your analysis data, for your scripts, and then for your outputs. And throughout the course of the semester, students create a fully reproducible research project using that protocol. So I think that's a great approach as well. Let's see. So something else that I think is a good step forward in terms of valuing data as a tier 1 research project is the Make Data Count project. So this is a way to standardize the ways that that data downloads and views and things like that are counted and shared in repositories. So we're hoping that, that data can be cited more often, but these other metrics will also potentially be important for measuring the impact of data. So I think that's a great project to stay aware of.
Thank you, Mara.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't aware of TIER. I'm gonna definitely look into that. That sounds super fascinating and important. Jen, please.
Well, I just wanted to talk briefly about citizen science and how that's coming more of a trend. So citizen science is or community science participatory based research. These are all where the scientist uses other, like the community to help them do research. And this is found to be valuable in many fields. It's from figuring out what's happening in environmental disasters to understanding animal monitoring, as with my system, to various other uses. And there's a lot of tools that are coming out around this to help you manage your data. So for instance, survey tools like RedCap, which is made for clinical surveys, so it's HIPAA compliant. Other things are like Open Data Kit, which is an app you can create surveys to push to your field workers' apps, and then they can, when they go into a place with no service, they can fill out the form, and right when they get back to internet, that form immediately goes to fill into whatever database that you have. There's also things like iNaturalist, where they're crowdsourcing animal observations. You can download iNaturalist right now, take a picture of a bird, and then send it in, and other people will also help you. They have machine learning algorithms from their vast database of tagged animals to help you identify the animal, and there are also other people who will go and look at it. The data quality around citizen science depends on how much you want, like, these scientists invest in that process. So for instance, for eMammal, we have a lot of on-site training where we invite people from nearby to help us put out cameras in the local area. So, but obviously that has limited scope because we can only reach the people who can physically come to Front Royal, Virginia, versus eBird, which has a massive reach because people all over the world love birds, and it's super easy. So it depends on the amount of data, the quality of the data, what you're looking for, and how much cleaning you want to do. The other part of citizen science is that you have to think, researchers have different mindsets. They have to think about feedback to the volunteers and engaging them, and giving them back for the data that they're contributing. So for example, eMammal has little summaries of the cameras you put out. So once you submitted your data and an expert has reviewed it, you come back with, look at how many animals you got correct, and look at how many animals you have, and this is how your camera, where your location and place compared to the rest of the project. And you also have to think about hiring people to manage the program too, because you're not, the researcher can start this effort, but very quickly most people realize that they're this is not what they want to be doing. They want to be publishing papers. So considering training people to do that engagement, doing that management.
Thank you, Jen. So these are all, I think these are all really important pieces of the broader picture of research data management. The thing I wanted to talk about is something slightly different. I think it's more in the, personal self-help area of research data management. When I talk to researchers, no matter what discipline they're in, one of the things I try to emphasize is intentionality. And being deliberate and making conscious choices about what you're doing with your data in ways that are aware of kind of the cause and effect. So for example, if I'm just learning to operate on a cluster, or I'm just learning to apply some computation to my research, and I'm still in the habit of putting spaces in my file names, suddenly that has a consequence of in my code, every time I invoke a file name, I have to put quotes around it, and that's extra steps, and it's one more thing to remember. And when, when the script fails, I have to remember that that's something I need to look at. And there are, many other examples of how a lack of intentionality. Really, am I frozen?
Yeah, you froze for a second.
Oh, okay, am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Jen. Plenty of other examples about how a lack of intentionality can affect the work down the road, especially with regard to storage. If you're working with sensitive data or human subjects and you're not intentional about where you put your stuff, you are potentially endangering your research subjects. You're potentially endangering your reputation as an ethical researcher. So, am I frozen again?
No, you're good.
Okay, cool. I can't. Yeah, Zoom is being weird for me. I can't really tell. So for people who are learning to be that mediator in between the researcher and the HPC resources, I mean, everybody brings intentionality to their own priorities, but recognizing that the researcher's priorities are not necessarily the same thing as the computing specialist's priorities, and trying to translate between the two, I think, is a really critical thing to be able to do in this context of research data management. At this point, we are at 4 to the hour, and so we are actually like bang on time. Go panelists! Thank you so much. We have plenty of time really for a follow-up Q&A up until the end of the panel, which ends at 10:15. We again have some questions for you if you don't want to talk. But if you do want to talk, feel free to park a question or a comment in the chat. And then if you're in the room, go ahead and raise your hand, go to a mic, get Jen's attention somehow. We'll figure this out for the next 15 minutes or so.
Okay, we have some questions in the room. Do we want to start with that?
Yeah, that'd be great, because my Zoom is not catching me up on the chat very quickly.
Did you want to do your question?
Yeah, so can you hear me on Zoom?
Mostly, yeah.
Mostly.
Shout.
So.
Oh, do you want to just come up here?
No.
No.
So you touched on institutional data repositories, and I know that most of you guys work with your research computing facilities, and they have much larger data storage and tiered groups that are different than institutional repositories and hold the large data sets. How much do you see not just working with, but integrating into their storage and workflows and data transfer nodes they have for sharing data? How do you guys see yourself with those groups?
Were you able to hear all of that?
Can you sum up, Jen? I think I got it, but let's make sure everybody in TV land got the question.
I'm looking at the speaker, and correct me if I'm wrong. So we talked about institutional data repositories, and they have access to research computing facilities, which has those large tiered groups for large data sets, has a lot of capacity. How much do we see as panelists integrating with the research computing facilities capabilities and et cetera, like workflows and data transfer nodes?
Mm-hmm.
I have a very short answer on my end.
Go for it, Megan.
So similar to some of the other folks, Iowa State's data storage is all over the place. We have weird funding, and so often colleges have their own, but there's been some efforts to centralize. For the data repository, right now we're only doing publishing research that can become public, so that's a very small snapshot of the total research data on campus. We know we're going to have some large data sets that want to be shared, and we're not going to be able to transfer those or host those on the data repository. We plan to make a metadata only record in our data repository that then we'll send it to IT to set up a Globus transfer to get to the data. That's our rough plan right now. We can integrate the large scale storage on our campus into our data repository if needed, but the transfer rates just aren't going to be sufficient for large data sets over the open web. So that's the hurdle we're looking at right now.
Thanks, Megan. Other comments on this question?
I can speak to that at Colorado State. So we offer free data deposits for data that is under 1 terabyte. And then if data is 1 terabyte or over, we have a cost model for storage. We haven't got a whole lot of uptake on that. I actually had my first somewhat large data deposit last week. It was 500 gigs, and they actually had to bring it over on a physical hard drive, which was kind of fun, but maybe not ideal. I know that we have used Globus to transfer large data sets in the past, and I think we'll get that working again in the near future.
My thought on high performance computing is that it's a lot of transient stuff. Like you have to like completely like delete data and make sure it keeps moving along so you clear up space. That doesn't exactly vibe with storing it forever.
So people, I mean, I'm going to speak more on this, but a lot of universities have an archive piece.
Yeah, although I'm gonna slightly differ with you. In my experience, most institutions do not have their own archive and do not have capability to handle large scale data sets locally. So a number of people have mentioned in the chat a project that is underway now here at OU called the OU and Regional Research Store, or our store. It's set up to cover any research or education data sets in EPSCoR states, EPSCoR jurisdictions across the US. And we have, I think, every EPSCoR jurisdiction except one signed up to participate in some way. I think ultimately we'll get all of them. It's a large scale tape archive, so this reflects back to what Janine had mentioned. And you'll be able to just put your data sets there using, in fact, Globus as the primary, not just data transport, but data sharing technology. So this reflects back to much of what's been discussed earlier, and the total cost will be buying your own tape cartridges. The rest will be covered by a combination of the grant and the OU internal funds. Yes,
so I have comments on archive. I work in 2 different institutions.
Can you make your comments while talking?
Yeah, not this way.
Okay, so I have a comments on archive from 2 different institutions experience in HPC. What I found out, if you open to the PI, say, giving the option to archive, they will dump anything in there. So one way to filter out is you tell them they have to pay a price for it. And that's when I find out a lot of time they just opt out. And tape, I found out that it is one of the best options still exists out there for, economically viable.
All right, that's it on the room side for now.
Okay, I want to respond to that just a little bit and just mention that libraries encounter that with our institutional repositories also. There's a recently published paper from someone at Oregon State. He went through the zipped files of dissertation and thesis data deposits and found all sorts of things. So this is not a problem that's unique to computing. And yeah, there's probably conversations to be had about ways to deal with that.
Yeah, I want to make just a related comment, perhaps. I'd like to hear people's perspectives on this because, folks have mentioned sort of, Jameen, you mentioned intentionality, and to me that sort of translates partly to advanced planning. And I continue to be surprised by the number of projects that intend to generate literally tens or hundreds of terabytes of data in a short space of time. And yet nowhere in the proposal was there provision for long-term storage of that. Just literally beyond the processes and the data management around it, it's just where's the storage, where's the data going to live? Just curious to hear what people have found on that front, or if it's just isolated.
I guess I would just chime in and say that that's definitely been a big push here to not have those kinds of surprises, because we've definitely had them where 3 months into, or 3 years into a project, someone says, well, you know, when I applied for this grant, we all knew that I was going to have this large, you know, bolus of data and it needed to go somewhere. So now we're going to do it, right? And because we don't have a for pay storage system, you know, at this point, we may evolve into something like that, but at this point, you know, our commitment is to store your data. That can be a real pinch point, especially if it comes in at the end of the year and a lot of the money for, you know, cyber infrastructure has basically been spent. And so the intentionality of basically the plan and getting people to really focus on, you know, what the products of their research are going to be and how much there will be and where they'll go is really important. And one thing that we haven't really talked about that also goes into that is just sort of end of life. Just recognizing that all data that are captured aren't worth saving. And so they're worth saving for a certain amount of time, but then at some point they need to go. And having a plan for that too is really important, because what we find is, in addition to zip files with lots of surprises, we find lots of directories that are just bloated with, like, you know, the third or fourth copy of something that we've already archived somewhere else, and things like that. And when you're working with them on a day-to-day basis, maybe it's okay to store those things. But eventually, a lot of these things need to be curated in a way where we say, this is keeping and this is going. And I think that intentionality is really important. And just, I know I'm taking a lot of time, but one more thing to sort of draw a thread through this is the idea of collaboration. And I think part of the intentionality has to be with the understanding that you are getting, typically you're getting grant money that someone expects you to use to share this information and to be valuable for other people. And so part of the intentionality of the plan has to be to make it discoverable and reusable and all that other good stuff. And that needs to be baked in at the beginning too. So it's not just, you know, where do we store it and surprise you need to store it, but how are we going to share it out?
I'd like to add on to that. We had a group that originally said they had 2 terabytes of data they needed to make public and share. And then when I sat down and talked with them, we found out it was nowhere near 2 terabytes, because that 2 terabytes included every draft of their data, not the final version. And in this case, it was a 3D model based on scanning data. The final model is going to be worth a lot because people can do comparisons with it, but the drafts are not going to be so much because they're going to have errors. So talking through with people to figure out what they need to share and what has priority is really important. People often don't, researchers aren't often asked that, so they don't think of that on their own naturally often.
I want to chime in here with something that Megan actually put in the chat earlier about at the point of creating the data management plan, encouraging researchers to check with computing, check with IT to see what kind of storage is possible. I know we've had cases where perhaps grad students or other faculty, just people who weren't familiar with the services available, promised things in their DMP that the university wasn't able to deliver. And, you know, they got the money. What are we supposed to do at that point? And I, as a librarian in this role, one of the things I focus on is fostering that communication, encouraging people to talk to each other at that point of planning, so that things aren't a surprise later on, as so many of the panelists have pointed out. Are there, assuming I'm not frozen, which I might be, Are there other questions or comments from TV land, from the room? We've got, looks like about 6 minutes left.
We have a question from the room.
Just a comment.
Oh,
So
comment.
about the archive, many PI, when they write grants, most of them don't have the knowledge that at one point that they will need to archive their data. But there are a few that know they have to have archive, but at the beginning they don't mention it, and they try to find something, a loophole on the IT, on the department, because at that point their data becomes so important to the university grant, and they can convince somebody to store their data. So they take advantage of the university's infrastructures. And at my institutions, we had an admin who had covered 3-4 department, and he promised the PI that he will store the data, but he was taking advantage of desktop backup system, and he was keeping their data into the desktop backup and multiple days. So a lot of, especially if you're a departmental IT, and mostly so falls on the admin, and central IT don't have any information. They come to surprises.
On another question, comment?
Yeah, just a comment. Same thing. I mean, Henry said that a lot of institutions don't have archive, but you're great. You help a lot of the other states. But one of the good and bad things that Office of Research is, a university is responsible for any researcher's data. So when an Office of Research gets heated or in trouble for data disappears because researchers have lost it, on a hard drive on a shelf, or at some grad students they didn't know about, sometimes that helps push the archive to make sure the institution has a copy of data that goes through things. It also pushes things like making sure during the PI's application process for proposal, they have checkboxes that have to go through. Do you have a data management plan? Talk to Janine, talk to people IT have storage to make sure they're in that process, because when they get sued for lost data, it costs them a lot more than trying to implement some of these data management plan and storage.
I know I didn't hear any of that comment.
So ultimately, the university is responsible for all of its researchers' data. So there needs to be processes. I think for the Smithsonian, we're trying to get our Office of Sponsored Projects to talk more. Like that's our office that handles all the grants that are going through. Right now, they're just going through and checking that the Smithsonian won't get sued for promises, but I think like they could do a lot more. They could like reach out to the other resources that are being planned and used. It's just the more things you add to that process, the less the researcher wants to do it. So we're, like if we tie it to the grant process, like researchers have to write grants. They can't get around that. But thinking about, we want to do it in a way that helps them, but also doesn't add like a million extra steps. So.
I think another point that's useful to keep in mind for everyone is to understand the institution's data policy, intellectual property policies, who on paper, who owns the data. Those are often questions that are nebulous when you get down to the level of the individual researcher or the project and their data. But I think increasingly that is a question that institutions are trying to be a little bit more clear about, who owns the research data and then therefore has the responsibility to deal with it long term. We have a question from on the Zoom chat. Can each of the panelists state their reporting role, library, IT, or a separate center? So my reporting line is through the libraries, and I'll just let the rest of the panelists pick theirs up. I'm going to start on the top left of my screen. How about you, Pete?
We have a merged organization, Library ILS. So I report to the VP of ILS, who basically oversees both of those. So I get to liaise basically between both sides.
Thank you. How about you, Vas?
Yeah, so we're in the VP of Research office, but because we're the sort of odd duck on campus, we cross all the different bridges to various groups. But ultimately, we report up to the VP of Research office, who also owns research computing.
Yeah. Mara?
I'm the only data person at the library at CSU, and I'm part of our digital collection services unit.
Thank you. Jen?
I'm part of the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. I report to a researcher, so I'm one of the rogue people.
And Megan?
I'm at the library. Currently, I'm in the research and instruction department, but we are hoping to spin off a scholarly communications department soon.
A scholarly communications department that will also include data stuff?
Correct.
Fancy.
Yeah, though we're not going to, I don't know if we're going to call it scholarly communications because no one knows what that is.
Fair enough. So we are 1 minute over time. If there were other questions, I apologize that we didn't get to you. Please put it in the chat, and we'll do what we can to get to those at some point. I do have one slide for Henry to mount to the website later. It is 2 suggested readings for you as you continue on this journey of being a facilitator in between researchers and computing resources. One of them is specifically about data management for researchers. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. And the other one, I think, kind of goes back to that theme of intentionality that we've been talking about, just communicating better with people and in between parties who have different priorities. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Henry, and thank you very much for your time. And thank you so much to our panelists for joining us this morning.
And to our moderator. All right, I'm gonna turn off the recording here.